All right. So new treatments of pulmonary fibrosis. So what do the results of recent clinical trials mean for me? Getting nervous that Darcy is walking around. Gonna ask me to sing. All right, so we're going to review the current treatment landscape for IPF and non-IPF progressive pulmonary fibrosis and discuss how new clinical trial results may impact our future approach to treatment. So in case you forgot, repetition is good. So phase 1, 2, and 3 studies are the 3 different phases that we have to go through. We typically aren't involved in phase 1 studies at St. Paul's or VGH. We do phase 2 studies and phase 3 studies. And again, of course, the phase 3 is the definitive trial where we're trying to prove benefit of a drug before it gets approved by Health Canada. Again, clinical trials, drug A, drug B, the placebo, we compare them at the end of that usually 52-week study. And then again, this is the sequence of trial events, and we would compare what the lung function does over time. Again, the blue line on the top is relative preservation of lung function over 52 weeks compared to placebo in the invisible line where things got worse over time. So this again showed that nintedanib slows the rate of lung function decline in IPF. And again, pirfenidone had the same kind of results that I'm just not showing. So that happened in 2014. And this was the Impulsis trial. That was the abbreviation for it. So if you're a pharma company designing a clinical trial, you want a nice, tidy name for your study. That's usually an abbreviation of a whole bunch of words that were in the trial protocol. So the Impulsis trial was done. And the FDA in the US, and I think in Canada and Europe, said, hold on a second, this is great for one trial, but there's statistically about a 1 in 20 chance that you had this happen just by fluke. And that's not good enough for us. We want to see 2 positive trials to convince us that this is an effective drug. And there's some rationale to that. So I think there's some justification for that. So the drug company, of course, knew this beforehand. So they did Impulsis 1, which is what I showed you, but they also did Impulsis 2. So they did 2 trials at the same time around the world. Impulsis 1 I showed you before, Impulsis 2 on the bottom right in red, they look exactly the same. So Impulsis 1 is good, Impulsis 2 is good, 2 thumbs up. That means we can be confident that nintedanib works on average in patients with IPF. Pirfenidone did the same kind of thing. Interestingly for them, their first 2 trials, one was positive, one was negative. They had to do a 3rd tie-breaking study. And that one was positive. And so pirfenidone also was proved to be beneficial. So that resulted in 2015, nintedanib and pirfenidone were both approved for the treatment of IPF. Across Canada, there were 2 kind of main criteria that needed to be met for people to be treated. One is that you needed to be diagnosed with IPF by somebody who arguably knew what they were doing. And secondly, you had to have your forced vital capacity, which is part of your breathing test, had to be over 50%. In different countries, sometimes there were different rules that were used, but this was fairly standard. These were the main rules in Canada. So in 2018, to continue with the nintedanib story, the drug company, so Boehringer Ingelheim, said, okay, it works in IPF. Other causes of pulmonary fibrosis have similar features, similar progression, so let's test it out in these other conditions as well, see what happens. And basically, they showed that nintedanib also slows the rate of lung function decline in non-IPF PPF. And sorry to Gail for using abbreviations, but that's the way that we label this in clinics. So patients with hypersensitivity pneumonitis or autoimmune conditions and so on, nintedanib works. There were some studies of pirfenidone as well that also suggested benefit, although those studies were just a little bit messier. They just weren't quite as nicely designed, but I think also pirfenidone works in this kind of condition as well. There are different reasons that we can get into, but pirfenidone hasn't been approved by Health Canada for this reason, even though I would say that it works just as well. So in 2020, nintedanib was approved for the treatment of non-IPF PPF. And the 2 major criteria was that you needed to have a diagnosis of PPF. you needed to meet certain criteria for progression. So there's a threshold of progression that you needed to meet over the preceding year. And you needed forced vital capacity greater than 45%. And again, pirfenidone hasn't been approved. I think it works. We can talk all afternoon about that if people want. So now what happens? So in 2024, just last week, or maybe it was even this week, nerandomilast, which is a mouthful, was reported to have met its primary endpoint in IPF. And if you have a good memory, nerandomilast was the top listing of IPF and PPF trials that were going on at St. Paul's and VGH. So this one has been completed. We know for IPF that it met its primary endpoint, which means that it slowed the rate of lung function decline in patients with IPF. I'm going to do a little bit of guesswork as to what we're going to see with this, because literally all we know right now is that it met its primary endpoint, which was change in forced vital capacity, your breathing test, over the year of that study. We don't know anything beyond that at this point. It was just a very one-line press release, essentially. We don't know how much benefit there was. We don't know if we got all the way up to that dashed flat line of total stability. We don't know if it was just like a little tiny bit of statistical improvement. We don't know what happened to any of the secondary endpoints, like quality of life or shortness of breath or how far you can walk or what your CT scan looks like or anything else. And we don't know the side effect profile. The drug company is happy enough that they're kind of going full steam ahead. They're planning on Health Canada applications and FDA applications and so on. And so there's a lot of energy in the company right now, but we don't know the details. We also don't know anything about the results of the PPF or the non-IPF trial. We'll know about that probably in early 2025. So what happens next? There's a lot of uncertainty, which hopefully I've conveyed to everybody. So there are a few key things that likely need to happen. So number one, we have to confirm that there is adequate efficacy or adequate benefit, which either needs to be, the FDA needs to be satisfied with one positive phase 3 trial, which would be helped if there are consistent secondary endpoints. So it's one thing if your forced vital capacity improves, but if everything else is not really improving, that leads to a lot of questions about the real benefit. But if we also see improvements in how far you walk, how short of breath you are, how much you cough, et cetera, then we're much more confident that this is a good drug for you. We also want to see that the other study, it's called Fibroneer, was the name of the study. We want to see that the one in progressive pulmonary fibrosis is also positive. And then we also need, of course, to see that it was safe. So it's no good if a drug slows progression, but if it has some awful side effects, that's not worth it either. And then if these are both reassuring, then it will go to Health Canada for approval, and then it will go to the provinces. And we've heard about how BC is usually last to approve things or to fund things. We won't know what the price point would be. I can make a guess. It will be expensive. Then would have it hopefully covered by extended health plans, which are sometimes faster, and I think usually faster than the province. So currently, we have two treatments for IPF. We have nintedanib, which is 150 milligrams twice daily for the full dose, or pirfenidone, 801 milligrams 3 times daily. It used to be that it was 3 pills 3 times a day. Now there's actually a 1 pill 3 times a day option. So we have two what are first-line treatments for IPF. They have similar benefit, similar tolerability, and I'm allowed as a doctor to, well, I give the option to patients usually, and it's, do you want diarrhea or do you want some other side effect? It's kind of how it's put. Yeah. And now we've got this third option, potentially. So I put question marks here. We might have nerandomilast, 18 milligrams once a day is probably going to be the dose that won out in that trial. But it's unclear whether and in what circumstances we'll be able to use that third medication. So we don't know if it's going to be allowed as a first line or a second line or a third line. It may be that this will probably come in more expensive than the previous versions of nintedanib and pirfenidone, partly because of inflation, partly because these drugs are now off patent or they will be off patent. Pirfenidone is already off patent, and nintedanib will be off patent in a couple of years in Canada. And as things come off patent, they get cheaper. If things are cheaper, they probably will require, the province will probably say, okay, try these other medications before you can try this new expensive medication. Maybe the benefit is going to be so dramatic that people say, you know what, it's first line. It works so much better than everything else. Let's go for it as first line. But that probably won't happen, would be my guess. And then the other question is, would it be studied as an add-on or as a replacement to these medications? So if you're on nintedanib, can we just add nerandomilast? Or if you're on pirfenidone, can we add nerandomilast? Right now we use nintedanib or pirfenidone, but maybe we'll be using nintedanib and nerandomilast, or pirfenidone and nerandomilast. So we don't know whether there's going to be like a cocktail kind of option for us as well. And that will largely be dictated by the people who are funding this medication. We also don't know whether the same approach would apply to progressive pulmonary fibrosis of the non-IPF variety. And we won't really know more until we see the full results, which probably will be in the spring of 2025. Right now, the drug company has crunched the numbers for the primary endpoint, but there's a whole bunch of other stuff that they need to go through and verify. And then the timeline of things, and this is my thought, but this is also, I met with some people from this drug company this morning, and they have the same kind of timeline. This is probably not going to be something that's available in clinic until 2026 at the earliest. Probably in 2026, though, would be my guess. So to summarize this part, I've just shown you the nerandomilast one. That's the one that's just most recently been reported out, and it is the third trial that's been positive for us, or the third drug that's been positive for us. There are a lot of other ones that are going on as well that will come out over the next couple of years. And hopefully we'll see more positive results that will bring us more effective and better tolerated treatment options. Nerandomilast may be one of these. I hope it is one of these, but we need to see some additional details from that study. We don't know if we're just going to be able to choose between these or whether there's potential combination therapy. I think eventually we will be moving toward combination therapy like what you would see in high blood pressure or cancer or other conditions. We do know that the biology of these diseases is very complex. There are a lot of different pathways that are involved, and each drug targets one pathway for the most part, and using a combination of drugs that target different parts of these pathways would probably be beneficial. And the details of how we use that, we won't really know this until 2026 probably. There are going to be some nuances of the study results, details about drug interaction studies. This is supposed to be regulatory body decisions about the funders and what they're going to allow us to do. So you'll have to wait until next year and maybe even the year after to hear about how we'll be using this medication and potentially others. And I'll stop there and thank everyone again for coming and for your attention, and I'm happy to stick around and answer any questions. Thank you.
Check. Dr. Ryerson, good to see you again. He was my respirologist and diagnosed me. I know your studies are primarily focused on people with IPF before they get transplants. Do you do any studies of people post-transplant, or is that a whole other area?
Yeah, that would be a whole other area, because with very rare exceptions, a transplant has cured you of the lung part of your disease. There are very few causes of interstitial lung disease that will recur after transplant. And so kind of my job is done, and the challenges that people might experience after transplant are really in the lung transplant domain and quite different. If you have an autoimmune condition, some of that will persist, but that's not in your lungs, it's in your joints or your skin, so that would be up to the rheumatologist. So short answer, no, we don't get involved.
And a secondary question is, I asked this when I was in hospital recovering from my transplant. Do you do, or does anybody do an autopsy, not an autopsy, but a biopsy of my old lungs to find out, were you right?
Yeah.
Was it really IPF?
So that raises lots of questions. So yes, the pathologists will look at your what we would call an explant, X meaning taken out of, an explanted lung. So they do look at that. They do provide us a report. We do look at it. Interestingly, when somebody gets that close to transplant, your lungs kind of are a mess. And there's this convergence that happens that almost no matter where you started from, whatever disease you started from, there's this convergence to just a mess at the end. And so it's actually quite hard to tease out what the initial cause was of that when we get into that very severe end stage. Biopsies earlier on in the disease allow us to see more the early manifestations, but towards the end, it's a bunch of scar tissue. So the biopsies are often not really all that informative, or the explanted lung tissue is not all that informative. We do look at it though. Sometimes we get surprised by something because sometimes there is enough to say, aha, but doesn't really help us usually.
Yeah, I asked the question more out of curiosity than anything else.
Mm-hmm.
Just one more quick question, sorry to dominate. The CARE IPF survey program,
CARE-PF, yep.
It's open to post-transplant people?
No.
You don't care about us?
We kind of don't care about you, yeah.
Man, once you get new lungs, these guys just write you off.
Yeah, I would expect and hope that the transplant clinic is following you, but you kind of... You really, it's a hard stop with us in a nice way because in a sense our job is done. Maybe we didn't do great because you ended up having to transplant, but our job is kind of done with you at that point, and the transplant team's job has begun. So they would be doing that kind of same stuff going forward. Yeah.
My question is, so like a clinical trial is only for the medication, the drugs trial, do you do non-medication treatment trial? Is the, with the FB patients, lots of them has a chronic disease, such kidney, liver, heart, or digestion, might cannot afford for the side effects. Uh-huh. So, do you do the trial for the non-medication treatment?
So trials for non-medication treatment, do you mean so things like exercise or diet or?
I would say the equipment, therapy or treatment.
So like oxygen or what kind of treatments are you meaning?
Say, like formal radiation, formal light therapy, physio,
so
acupuncture.
Yeah, so we're not involved in any of those. There aren't trials that I'm aware of that are of those ones that are I don't want to be too judgmental about them, but there's a very strict kind of process and methodologic rigor that the trials need for us to participate in them. And there's certain things that we are familiar with and certain things that we're not. And you don't want me involved in an acupuncture trial, as an example. So we just don't participate in those. I'm not aware of those studies being done. And sometimes the trials that we get involved in, they come with a lot of background data behind them based on, usually they start, so a drug company will decide to test a medication like, let's say, nintedanib or pirfenidone. They'll decide to test that based on first looking at the blood of patients or the lung tissue of patients with pulmonary fibrosis and seeing that the drug targets certain pathways that are involved in fibrosis. And then they'll test that in mice or sometimes in dogs and then in humans. And there's a stepwise kind of process where there's a lot of biological plausibility that this drug would work in these conditions. Some of these other ones, like the light therapy or acupuncture, there isn't that clear building up that explains the biologic plausibility for those treatments to work for the biology of what's going on in pulmonary fibrosis. So I haven't been convinced by anything really in those areas to say that these are potentially effective treatments. Whereas for the drug trials that we participate in, I can be shown the experiments beforehand that say, okay, yeah, this drug makes sense in this condition. We do have to test it, but there's plausibility that it will work.
Do you know any like a clinical trial or the research center is doing this for the non-drug
Not in Canada.
treatment?
Yeah, not in Canada.
Other country in the world?
Maybe, but I wouldn't be familiar with that.
Do they do a study on the diet and exercise program?
Sorry.
Do they do a study on research of the diet and exercise?
Are you talking about
program?
the nitrate one that I mentioned?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that one has some plausibility, and there are studies showing that relatively high amounts of nitrate, like more than what you would get just by eating a whole bunch of beets every day. There are some studies that show that your muscles uptake and kind of use oxygen better with that kind of medication, essentially. And so there's a biologic plausibility of that one. And so that was a study that me and a colleague, we have a PhD student who is coordinating that study. That's her PhD thesis, is to take 20 patients. You get 2 weeks of this high nitrate supplement. We exercise you before and after, see how well you do. And then we give you 2 weeks without, and we see how well you do. So that's a study that's going on at St. Paul's right now. No, we're giving you pills. It's essentially it's like highly concentrated beet juice because beets are kind of really high in nitrate, but it's that idea. But it's a pill that we end up giving. I can't remember if it's a pill or a liquid that we're giving.
As a patient, I just wanted to say before I had to leave how much I value this team and St. Paul's and how cared about I personally feel, and I've heard that from other people, and that makes all the difference in terms of hope. So thank you for all you do.
Yeah. I'm just wondering how frustrating is it to work in a province that's the last to accept your research?
Yeah, it's frustrating. I think it's a challenge not just in BC. So I think everywhere there's if I go to, I don't know how to do this. There we go. If you look at this, I've got a ton of conflicts of interest. So somebody can look at this and say, well, you're just a shill for pharma. And I think there's a perception, or there's a feeling from some people that doctors are just in the back pockets of pharma. And there's some truth to that, I'm sure. I like to think that I'm not, but I know I'm not naive enough to know that I get influenced as well by some of these things. So it is frustrating that there is a perception that we have to be skeptical of every new treatment and we have to delay things. And I think sometimes it ends up being it's just a cost savings kind of decision where if we can delay approval by a year, we're going to save $1 million. Or however much it is. It might be more than $1 million for some of these drugs. And I think the province actually is I think, first of all, holding a lot of skepticism about the pharma industry, about them having ulterior motives, and having worked with a lot of pharma, I actually think most of them are just like us. They're good people trying to make a difference. And I think it's dismaying, I think, that we hold pharma in a negative light a lot of the time that way. And then I think it's a shame too that delaying treatment approval by a year saves a bunch of money, and sometimes that's a decision that people make. So very frustrating. I'm going to take this off my disclosure. I get a little bit nervous with that up there.
It's not all that bad.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.